If you wielded America's deadliest squad armament in World War II, you possessed approximately 30 minutes to survive once combat commenced. That represented the projected survival duration for a bar operator. Because the Germans discovered very rapidly that the quickest method to neutralize an American squad was to eliminate the individual holding the automatic rifle initially. But the combat zone was merely one aspect of this armament's sinister narrative. Before it ever returned to terrorize Germans in the Second World War, the bar would transform into the preferred instrument of America's most brutal outlaws, penetrating through police vehicles and officers during Prohibition's bloodiest period. Now, before we explore why Germans came to despise and dread this armament so intensely, we need to comprehend what challenge it was constructed to address in the first place. And that transports us back to the dugouts of World War I, where assaulting infantry confronted a catastrophe that no existing armament could resolve. The fundamental challenge was synchronization. Artillery could hammer enemy dugouts before an offensive, suppress the defenders, keep their heads lowered, but that bombardment had to cease before friendly forces went over the parapet. Otherwise, you'd be shelling your own soldiers as they progressed. And in that interval between when the artillery ceased and when the attackers actually arrived at the enemy dugout, defenders who'd been sheltering in bunkers would ascend back up, position their machine guns, and mow down wave after wave of soldiers crossing exposed terrain. Conventional fire and maneuver strategies, where a portion of a unit shoots while the remainder advances, decelerated everything and diminished the quantity of fire you could deliver on the enemy, because only some of your force was actually shooting at any particular instant. What militaries required was a method to maintain continuous fire while the complete assault formation moved forward collectively. The French developed a partial solution in the Chauchat. You've probably encountered it, and probably not in a complimentary manner. But here's the aspect about the Chauchat that often gets disregarded. It was actually the initial armament to demonstrate that a single soldier could transport automatic firepower forward during an offensive. French units utilized Chauchat teams not just to deliver general fire, but as mobile machine gun hunters, advancing toward enemy positions with grenades and automatic fire to neutralize them. The concept functioned, but the implementation left much to be desired. The Chauchat was awkward to fire from the hip. Its lengthy recoil mechanism produced an irregular kick that battled against the shooter, and external components snagged on everything. American forces who received versions converted to 3006 encountered even worse reliability challenges. So while the French had demonstrated that man-portable automatic armaments could transform how infantry assaults functioned, they hadn't constructed the ideal instrument for the task. Heavy machine guns existed, of course, but their mass, their cooling requirements, and the fact that they demanded entire crews to operate made them defensive armaments. You simply couldn't advance across no man's land while dragging a water-cooled Maxim behind you. The US Army examined alternatives, including the French Berthier light machine gun, which actually tested successfully with the Marine Corps and Army in 1917. But manufacturing and financial challenges killed that program. In the end, the responsibility of constructing a purpose-built automatic rifle for what they called walking fire went to John Moses Browning. And by this point in his career, Browning had decades of experience designing firearms across multiple systems. If anyone could solve this challenge, it was him. What Browning had in mind was something quite specific. He wanted a man-portable rifle chambered in 3006, capable of both semi-automatic and fully automatic fire, durable enough to handle mud and debris, reliable under the worst circumstances, and fed from a magazine larger than the standard 5-round service rifle. The magazine capacity settled at 20 rounds for ground utilization. 40-round magazines were tested, but they proved too awkward for prone firing and mostly got set aside. Now here's the tactical concept that the entire armament was constructed around, and this matters because it explains why the original BAR functioned the way it did. A group of soldiers equipped with bars would advance on an enemy position, firing mainly from the hip and mainly in semi-automatic mode. The purpose was to deliver enough fire on the enemy to keep defenders suppressed while the assault formation closed the distance. You weren't attempting to strike specific targets at this point. You were attempting to make every German in that trench keep his head down instead of shooting at you. Then, once the assault reached very close range, the selector would be switched to full automatic for brief, intense bursts during the final rush and the trench combat that followed. This concept has actually been compared to the later assault rifle idea, meaning an armament used mainly for controlled semi-automatic fire, but with an automatic option when needed up close. The key difference is that the Bayard did this with a full power .30-06 cartridge, while later assault rifles were constructed around intermediate rounds that were much easier to control on full auto. The BAR was asking soldiers to handle serious recoil, but the payoff was stopping power and range that lighter rounds simply couldn't match. One detail worth mentioning is the fire selector design. Browning made it deliberately stiff, requiring real effort to move, often needing 2 fingers or even both hands. The selector moved from safe, which was closest to the shooter, forward to semi-automatic, then forward again to full auto. Moving from semi to auto was easy thanks to a spring-loaded stop, but getting back to safe required deliberate force. This way, a soldier switching modes under stress couldn't accidentally end up unsafe and find his rifle dead at the worst possible moment. The original bar weighed around 16 pounds. Compare that to the Lewis gun at over 20 pounds. That difference mattered because shoulder fire was part of what the bar was meant to do. You couldn't realistically fire a Lewis from the shoulder, but the BAR was designed for it when the situation called for aimed shots. The sights came directly from the model 1917 Enfield rifle, which had an excellent rear aperture peep sight system, good for reasonably precise shooting at range. Production turned into its own kind of mess with 3 different companies involved: Colt, Winchester, and Marlin. There were contract disputes, production delays, and at one point Browning himself refused to participate in Winchester demonstrations of his own design because of earlier bad blood between them. By war's end, roughly 52,000 M1918 BARs existed, and about 48,000 of them shipped overseas before the armistice. Even though bars were arriving in France by summer 1918, with at least 17,000 in country by the end of July, American units often continued using Chauchats at the front while bars piled up in reserve. And this was on purpose. General Pershing was worried that early limited use of the BAR would let German forces capture examples, figure out how they worked, and maybe start making their own. At the time, commanders still expected the war to continue well into 1919, with major offensives planned for spring on both sides. Pershing saw the BAR as a potentially decisive armament and didn't want to give it away too soon. His plan was to field it in large numbers all at once, equipping entire divisions at the same time, rather than letting it trickle into combat piece by piece, where the Germans could grab one and study it. Actual first combat use came on September 22, 1918, just before the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Early reports said it performed exceptionally well when firing, easier to handle and more effective than the Chauchat, which, to be honest, wasn't a difficult thing to achieve. Since engagements were still fairly rare and the rifle had limited time in the field, early tests often measured how well it held up under marching, mud, and lack of cleaning rather than sustained firefights. The data showed that bars were far less likely to be abandoned during advances compared to other automatic armaments. When lighter guns broke down mid-assault, soldiers often abandoned them rather than stopping to repair them. And while 400 Chauchats got ditched during comparable operations, only 72 bars suffered the same fate. The bar came with its own dedicated web gear. 3 different belts existed, one for the gunner, one for the first assistant, and one for the second assistant. The gunner's belt was the most interesting because it included a metal cup mounted on the right side, designed specifically to hold the butt of the BAR during walking fire. Hip firing while advancing wasn't something soldiers improvised. It was official doctrine. From the very first encounters, the bar terrified Germans who'd never seen or heard anything like it. American units reported capturing many prisoners who were simply too shaken by the new armament to keep fighting. The armistice cut short the period when the BAR might have fully proven itself in that war. But the groundwork was laid for its fearsome reputation. But before the BAR would terrify Germans again in the next World War, it would play a role in some of the darkest events of the interwar years, and these had nothing to do with military service. When World War I ended, those 52,000 M1918 BARs sat in military depots and National Guard armories across America. Guard facilities had part-time staff and weaker security, which made them easy targets. And during Prohibition's most violent years, America's most notorious criminals took full advantage. Clyde Barrow made the bar his signature armament. He preferred it over the Thompson submachine gun because the .30-06 cartridge could punch through the thick steel doors and fenders of 1930s automobiles, something the Thompson's .45 ACP couldn't do reliably, which came in handy for firefights with police hiding behind their cars. On July 7, 1933, Clyde and Buck Barrow broke into a National Guard armory in Enid, Oklahoma, stealing 5 bars, 46 Colt .45 pistols, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. Clyde modified his stolen armaments by cutting down the barrel and gas tube, chopping the stock just behind the pistol grip and welding 3 20-round magazines together to give himself 60 rounds before reloading. He was basically building crude versions of what Colt would later sell as the Monitor. The Barrow gang's firepower was devastating against law enforcement armed with revolvers and shotguns. At a 1933 shootout in Joplin, Missouri, Bonnie Parker laid down covering fire with a BAR while the gang killed 2 lawmen. One highway patrol sergeant recalled that the little red-headed woman filled his face with splinters on the other side of that tree with one of those guns. When Bonnie and Clyde were finally ambushed in May 1934, their car held 3 full-auto bars and 100 loaded 20-round magazines. This violence led directly to the National Firearms Act of 1934, which slapped a $200 tax on machine guns. That might not sound like much today, but in 1934 dollars that came out to roughly $4,700, deliberately set high enough that most people could never afford it. Colt responded by developing the R80 Monitor specifically for law enforcement with an 18-inch barrel that brought the weight down to just 14 pounds. By the late 1930s, with another war looking more and more likely, the US Army decided to update the BAR. And this is where things started going wrong in ways that would affect soldiers for the next 2 decades. The M1918. BAR-2 adopted in 1938 was a fundamental change in how the Army thought about the BAR. They got rid of semi-automatic fire entirely, replacing it with 2 automatic rates, slow at 300 to 450 rounds per minute, using a hydraulic buffer, and fast at 500 to 650 rounds per minute. The rate reducer was basically a complicated device that jammed up whenever it wasn't cleaned regularly, which in combat conditions meant it jammed up a lot. The changes added weight too. The original 16 pounds grew to nearly 20 once you bolted on the bipod, flash suppressor, and hinged buttstock monopod. The World War I-style rear aperture sight, which was actually quite good for aimed shooting, got swapped for a different arrangement that many found less useful. The buttstock was reshaped for prone firing. You see, the Army was trying to turn the BAR into a light machine gun, and most of these changes made the armament worse at what the original M1918 did best without actually making it a proper light machine gun either. The bipod is a perfect example. It added nearly 3 pounds to a gun that was already pushing 20 pounds, and because it mounted at the muzzle, it actually caused barrel flex that hurt accuracy. Soldiers in the field often found it more annoying than helpful. The fixed barrel was the biggest problem compared to true light machine guns. Unlike the British Bren or the German MG-34 and MG-42, American gunners couldn't swap out overheated barrels during sustained fire. Accuracy dropped off badly after prolonged shooting, and the only fix was to limit yourself to controlled bursts. The funny thing is that FN in Belgium had offered the US Army their quick-change barrel design and better rate reducer back in 1938 to 1939, but the Army turned them down because it wouldn't work with existing M1918 receivers. So what did soldiers actually do with all these improvements? They took them off. Lieutenant Colonel John George wrote that 2 weeks after they were on Guadalcanal, they'd thrown away all the gadgets, including the bipod, and were using the guns stark naked, the way old John Browning had built them in the first place. World War II production reached about 190,000 armaments. Training doctrine made the BAR the squad's only automatic armament with a 3-man team: gunner, assistant gunner, and ammunition bearer. The gunner carried 220 rounds in 11 20-round magazines, while the assistant carried more magazines and stood ready to take over when the gunner went down. And that's the key word. When, not if. All squad members got basic BAR training because the Army expected designated gunners to become casualties. The BR was the most dangerous thing to carry because eliminating that one armament meant the whole squad's ability to put down suppressive fire dropped dramatically. So every German who spotted an American squad knew exactly who to shoot first. An intelligence report noted that in all infantry engagements, the enemy constantly gave priority attention to the BAR in the squad. Germans captured American BARs and put them into service themselves. They also used Polish-manufactured bars that they grabbed during the 1939 invasion and kept using them right through to the end of the war. About 20,000 had been in Polish service before the Germans took the country. Now, for some idea of what Americans were actually up against, the majority of German soldiers carried Kar 98K bolt-action rifles. Armaments like the STG-44 or FG-42, which might be considered roughly similar to what the BAR was trying to do, came out in much smaller numbers. The FG-42 saw only about 7,000 units built. The STG-44 reached a couple 100,000, but the bolt-action KAR 98K saw over 14 million produced, which shows you the clear difference in scale. German squads were built around their MG-34 and MG-42 machine guns, with the riflemen there mainly to support and protect the gun crew. So while those purpose-built German machine guns significantly outgunned the BAR in sustained automatic fire, the BAR in turn could outgun several German soldiers armed with bolt-action rifles left over from the previous war. Now let me tell you about some of the men who carried this armament and what they did with it to make that German hatred run even deeper. Charles DeLopp of the 82nd Airborne became the only soldier from that division to receive the Medal of Honor during the Normandy campaign. His platoon was caught in a position where they faced complete destruction. So DeLopp made a choice that everyone in that unit knew meant his death. He stepped out of cover and knelt in the middle of the road, completely exposed, firing his BAR to cover their withdrawal. He took hits almost immediately, but kept firing burst after burst until he was finally killed. His comrades later found the ground around his position covered with dead Germans and wrecked automatic armaments. Wilson Watson of the 3rd Marine Division earned the nickname One-Man Regiment on Iwo Jima. Over 2 days in February 1945, he killed 60 Japanese soldiers firing from the hip while charging pillboxes in exactly the way John Browning had originally imagined walking fire would work. He climbed a jagged slope under heavy fire, reached the top, and held his ground for 15 minutes until his ammunition ran out completely. And then there was Henry Schauer of the 3rd Infantry Division, who pulled off what some call the greatest shooting performance with a BAR in the entire war. During fighting in Italy, he walked 30 yards straight toward enemy fire, stopped while 4 German riflemen were shooting at him, and killed all of them with 4 bursts at different ranges. Then he dropped 2 machine gunners at 60 yards with a single burst, followed by 4 more Germans at 500 yards with accurate fire. The next day, he wiped out another 4-man machine gun crew at 80 yards while tank shells were landing within 20 yards of where he stood. His fellow soldiers started calling him Kraut Killer. In Normandy's hedgerow country, the BAR proved essential for close-quarters fighting where you often couldn't see more than 100 meters. Heavy automatic fire was considered the best way to flush defenders out of hedges, and soldiers begged, borrowed, or stole extra bars whenever they could to counter German firepower. Against Japanese banzai charges in the Pacific, the BAR's automatic fire often meant the difference between holding a position and getting overrun. The Marines understood this, and by war's end had increased bars from 513 per division in 1943 to 867 per division in 1945, building 13-man squads with 3 fire teams, each carrying its own bar. Tropical conditions brought their own problems. The gas cylinder, which was never upgraded to stainless steel, rusted solid from corrosive-primed M2 ammunition if you didn't strip and clean it every single day. Wooden stocks rotted in the humidity, which led to the 1942 introduction of plastic buttstocks made by Firestone rubber. And the 20-round magazine remained a constant headache, emptying in roughly 2 to 4 seconds of sustained fire and forcing constant reloads while German belt-fed guns could keep shooting for 250 rounds or more without stopping. The bar stayed in service as the main squad automatic armament through the Korean War, and some say it was still being used into the early Vietnam years by soldiers who valued its firepower over newer options. The M60 machine gun was formally adopted in 1957 as the eventual replacement when the BR's limitations had finally caught up with it. The fixed barrel, the 20-round magazine, the weight and the need to switch to the new NATO standard 7.62 by 51 mm cartridge. So an armament designed for walking fire in the trenches of 1918 ended up serving through Korea in a completely different role than Browning ever imagined. And it took the Army nearly 40 years to finally let it go.